From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. This is a special edition of Balance of Power, live coverage of the Democratic National Convention. We are now about 1 hour into the second night of the virtual Democratic Convention. We've already heard from two former presidents, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. And later this hour, we're going to hear from former Second Lady of the United States, Dr. Jill Biden, and from former Secretary of State, John Kerry. But right now, the convention is holding its roll call vote on the nomination of Joe Biden. Like everything, it's being done somewhat differently this time, but some things will remain the same, with the home state of the nominee, that's Delaware in the case of Joe Biden, expected to cast the ballots to put him over the top and make the nomination official, and we will bring you that as it happens. Right now, though, we want to welcome our Bloomberg political contributors with us throughout the convention: Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College. So welcome to both of you. Rick, let's start with you tonight. Give us your take of last night. Was it a success for the Democrats?
Well, I think one of the things that they were able to do effectively is get their message out. So Michelle Obama was a terrific messenger. She went right after Donald Trump in a hard way and implored the Democratic Party to do something they didn't do 4 years ago, and that is turn out in big numbers. That was the good news. The bad news is that last night's viewership was 20% below where it was 4 years ago. So the effort of using Michelle Obama to get a good audience to this very unique convention that nobody really knew how it was going to turn out as far as viewership goes is a little bit disappointing on night one. So we'll see what happens tonight with Dr. Jill Biden as the anchor of tonight's program, and see if we can attract more viewers to tonight's program.
So Jeannie, do they have much of a hope of doing that? I mean, Michelle Obama was a pretty big gun on the first night. I mean, you talk about a draw, you'd expect her to have the draw. So I'm not sure what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think, we have to be a little careful because so much of this is streaming and all of the numbers, and Rick is right, the, viewership is down on live TV, but there's streaming, and I know, talking to students all day long, they don't watch anything live. Everything they do is look at it streaming and afterwards. I think one of the things that last night did, and Rick talked about this, they talked about the fact that Trump is not, in their view, qualified to be president. And I think for the Democrats, what they really need to think about is if they want to pull over these voters who they need to persuade in these swing states, they're going to have to do more than just talk about how he's not disqualified and talk about what Joe Biden is going to do on the economy, on COVID, in terms of, restoring America, restoring stability. I think that sort of positive policy message, which, as Rick knows, is hard to do in any convention, that's where they need to get to persuade these independent and moderate voters. And I don't know yet if they've gotten there.
Well, Rick, it's early going in the week as a practical matter. Is the move tonight, moving away from that, what Jeannie correctly says was really largely an attack on the current president of the United States, is it moving toward let's get to know Joe Biden, and particularly let's get to know him through his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, because that's really the high point, I suspect, of tonight?
Yeah, tonight, Dr. Jill Biden's going to do something that really the American public have not seen. Talk about herself, talk about her experience in the classroom, the challenges in education and her background, but also from the spouse's point of view, how we should think about Joe Biden. Even though he's been around public life for as long as we've all been around, we don't really know him that well. He's played second fiddle to people like Barack Obama. We feel like we've gotten to know him over the last 8 years. But certainly, Joe Biden's got some catching up to do. And tonight is the beginning of that sort of effort to try and portray Joe Biden as something other than a politician.
So, Jeannie, one thing I'm a little curious about, the theme tonight, the Democrats have said their theme is leadership matters, okay? That's about leadership. Do people vote for president based on leadership? That seems like a sort of an abstract kind of concept.
Yeah, I mean, certainly people don't vote on foreign policy. We know that unless there's a crisis. So if it's foreign policy leadership, absolutely not. I think what they're trying to talk about is sort of a restoration of the kind of leadership that people remember pre-President Trump. I think they want to talk about that by bringing out some former presidents, which they've done tonight, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton. But I think for progressives in the party, bringing out a Bill Clinton, certainly bringing out a Colin Powell, reminds them of things they may not want to think about, like the Iraq War. So, there's a positive and negative here when they bring out some of these former leaders and say this is what Joe Biden is going to restore to the White House. I think what Biden needs to do is to break out from under the shadow of President Obama and talk about what he is going to do differently in all of these areas.
So, as I said, our Bloomberg political contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino will be staying with us throughout the evening. But let's be frank, this entire convention is figuring out who gets to occupy the White House for the next 4 years, and somebody already has that position. We turn now to our Bloomberg White House reporter, Mario Parker. So Mr. Trump obviously occupies the White House. How is he reacting to all this as far as you can tell, Mario?
Well, so far, this evening, he's been tweeting a little bit. Earlier this evening, he retweeted one of his supporters who was criticizing Colin Powell's speech later on tonight, characterizing Colin Powell as a puppet of the establishment. He's also tweeted about an hour or so ago that would someone please tell Democrats that the reason we have more cases, more coronavirus cases, is because we have more testing. It's a familiar defense that the president has employed in recent months as cases have resurged in the U.S. Other than that, he's been, David, on this counter-programming tour, if you will, visiting swing states to try to at least quell some of the attention that Democrats are getting this week.
Okay, to bring everybody up to date, we have a roll call vote going on at the convention right now. We're up to North Dakota. We expect this to be orchestrated so that Delaware actually puts it over the top. So, Mario, we are seeing some Republicans. Last night we saw John Kasich, former governor of Ohio. Tonight we're seeing Colin Powell. We're going to see a brief appearance actually by the late John McCain as well. Are the Republicans, and particularly the Trump campaign, at all worried about really taking away some Republicans from their base?
This is an important counter move on the part of Biden, because the Trump campaign has been trying to portray Biden as a vessel or, again, a puppet of the most radical parts, the most extreme parts of the party. They are trying to paint him as a vessel, an empty vessel for the aspirations of Bernie Sanders and AOC as well. So the fact that the Biden campaign is putting forth some moderates, centrists, if you will, and then also, of course, Republicans who may be disaffected with President Trump is very important. They're trying to make him a lot more palatable to those individuals.
Mario, thank you so much. Stay with us for coverage. We want to go now to the convention because Joe Biden has just gone over the top, the number needed to nominate him for President of the United States.
Infrastructure that'll create good-paying jobs for skilled union workers like Josh, and the future will be made in America. Ohio cast 20 votes for Senator Bernie Sanders and 134 votes for the next president, Joe Biden. OH.
I-O.
Oklahoma.
99 years ago, racial violence devastated a thriving black community here in Tulsa. Today, hatred still lives in our nation, but so does resolve. Oklahoma refused to let ourselves be defined by division then, and our nation must turn back the tide of violence again now. Oklahoma cast 13 votes for Bernie Sanders and 24 votes for our next president, Joe Biden.
Oregon.
As Black Americans standing on Native land, we proudly represent Oregon. The dual viruses, COVID-19 and racism, laid bare unequal healthcare access and deaths in communities of color.
The Democrats are working to bridge divides and make sure
what we're listening
everyone
to
has
here
equal
is the
access
roll
to
call
vote.
vote as we go through state after state. We have not heard from Delaware, Joe Biden's state. It's expected that they will actually come in at the very end to wrap it up, although he's already gone over the number required. So Rick, I want to come back to you here. As watching this, it does strike me, to go back to your point about the convention last night, this is a far cry from what we saw on the typical convention floor, with somebody standing up for the great state of Kansas and everybody's roaring and things like that, demonstrations going on. This is somewhat more subdued, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, it's missing those moments that conventions typically give you, and frankly, it's what those moments are is what people remember over years. Some turn of a phrase in a speech by the candidate or his family, the appearance for the first time in the hall by the candidate and his family. I mean, these are things that are finely orchestrated. A good friend of mine, Mike Deaver, who did this for Ronald Reagan, thought that the moments are what really paid off in these conventions. And it's extremely hard to create these kind of moments on video.
Well,
and so I think that's one of the things we're missing in this process.
Jeannie, this is such a great point. Mike Diva was so famous, but as I understand it, even in the White House when President Reagan had been elected, he wanted to make sure every day there was one of those moments, one of those photos that would capture the imagination. How do you create that moment, that photo, that image in this new virtual streaming world?
It's so hard to do. It's so hard to break through in this world. And it's funny, just listening to what you and Rick were just talking about, I was listening to Ann Richards' speech at the convention, and it was such a magical moment. And there's been so many of those over the years, but it's awfully hard to do when you don't have a live audience, when you don't have people to react. And so, you know, it is amazing what Michelle Obama did last night, because she was able to give a really good speech with no audience there. That's tough to do, and that's sort of what's missing here, these sort of, you know, off-the-cuff moments that you hard to create.
So, Jeannie and Rick, stay with us, please. We're up to Rhode Island now, and we're going to keep going until we get to Delaware. We'll bring you that when that happens. In the meantime, we're trading over in Asia, and we want to get a check on where the Asian markets over there, particularly because, as I understand it, there's a big storm brewing. We go now to Sophie Kamarudin in Hong Kong for a market check.
Yeah, David, that would be Typhoon Higos, which has shut down Hong Kong public transportation this morning. And stock trading has been scrapped for the morning. We're going to wait to see if the afternoon session will continue as normal. But taking a look at the board this morning, we have Chinese stocks, the laggard in the region, while the MSCI APAC index is extending gains at a January high. And among the mainland market laggards, check out the tech-heavy small cap gauge, the Chinex, halting a 3-day rally with EV battery maker CATL falling on its soft earnings. So we're seeing some divergence when it comes to the yuan, the onshore rate trading just below 693, while we have the offshore rate continuing to trade below 692 this morning. And just want to pull up this chart really quick on the terminal for a broader look at where Asian stocks stand in relation to their U.S. peers. We're seeing the correlation break down with the MSCI APAC index's 30-day correlation with the S&P 500 now in negative territory amid the divergence that we're seeing on earnings, policies, and now politics, David.
Okay, thank you so much to Bloomberg's Sophie Kamarudin for that market check. Whoever occupies the White House in the next 4 years will have his hands full with an economy battered by the pandemic and the shutdowns it triggered, leading to a sharp drop in GDP despite massive monetary and fiscal intervention. For more on what a Biden presidency would mean for the economy, welcome now Adam Posen. He is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Jeannie Zaino and Rick Davis are still with us here. So, Adam, thank you so much for being here. The economy will loom so large on the agenda of whoever sits in the White House come January. What are the challenges that a President Biden would have, or for that matter, President Trump would have?
Thank you for having me, David. I mean, obviously, the first challenge is recovery from the pandemic, and that is first and foremost a public health concern. But the real issue is going to be what happens to the millions of workers in industries that are shrinking and in the millions of workers that are going to permanently shrink, like, you know, in-person nail salons are probably not going to go back to normal. In-person restaurants are not going to be the same size as they were. And you're going to have a lot of people who need to find new opportunities and be helped. But also there are millions of people who are going to be looking after children and elderly at home even more than before. We're already seeing that. So it's going to be a time of huge transformation for the American workforce. The second big challenge is how do we get from the kinds of furlough and stimulus that should be happening now to a longer-term path that's sustainable. And that's going to rely as much on Congress as on the president.
What do we know about Joe Biden and his approach to those sorts of problems as opposed to President Trump's? I think at this point we have a pretty good sense of how President Trump handles those things. How would a Joe Biden differ in your estimation?
I think on the facts, it's very easy to see a huge difference. I think first off that the stimulus and whatever help is given will be more direct and more to low-income people and less about tax cuts for people who are already working anyway. I think that there will be better coordination with Congress, although to be fair, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and NEC Chair Kudlow have actually done a pretty good job working with Congress until the last month. But on an ongoing basis, probably much better working with Congress unless you get a clear Republican majority still in the Senate. I think there's going to be a fundamental shift, which I haven't mentioned yet, in terms of regulation and supervision of various industries. And the question is, how much does President Biden, if elected, turn everything around, particularly in environmental and labor areas, through executive order versus how much restore the status quo ante and then try to change things through legislation. Otherwise, we just keep swinging back and forth with every new president.
And Adam, in terms of what you've heard so far during the campaign from Joe Biden, from the Democrats, what would you like to hear them say? You know, I deal a lot with young people, and I have to say students that graduated in May in the midst of this pandemic and those that are set to graduate next year are awfully concerned about this job market, the costs of their debt, obviously, the cost of health care. What's the number one thing you would like Joe Biden and the Democrats to say they're going to do day one when they get, if they are elected, if they get into the White House, in terms of moving the economy through this difficult period?
It's incredibly challenging, but I think the number one thing that they have to do is come up with a better way of supporting state and local governments, including their activities of community colleges, of education, of public service jobs. That's going to have to be something from the first day if we do not get the stimulus bill through. And the second thing is reallocating the burden of taxes. We don't necessarily have to raise taxes a lot, but we need to change both for perceptions of fairness and for economic efficiency where the burden of taxes hit. Right now, it's too much on earning people. And one third thing, sorry if it's too much, but this is where the left wing of the party does have some use, is in this area, is to think about antitrust for a digital age. How do we get dynamism back in this economy, which will create new jobs?
So, Rick, what did you want to ask Adam?
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that, Adam. I mean, one of the things that is getting hotly debated in Washington right now is the tax structure for these internet companies. And Democrats really, I mean, speaking as a Republican, have been pretty progressive on going after these guys who they see as amassing enormous amount of wealth at the expense of the taxpayers, who then share a bigger and bigger burden personally on the tax code. Do you see that there could be progress, especially on a bipartisan basis in Washington next year, regardless of who is elected president?
Yeah, there certainly should be. And there was a brief moment when the big tax cut package passed at the end of President Trump's first year in office, where there were some progress, not just on potentially changing some of those tax codes, but also the international aspect, which you need to do to make sure that the Amazons and the Facebooks and the Apples are not routing their profits through Bahamas or Ireland. So there is room to do that. I cannot politically how obstreperous a Republican Senate, say, would be. But there's certainly enormous support across a range of voters, across a range of states, and frankly, across a range of policy analysts for some kind of change. I mean, you can look at the writings of some people at the Cato Institute and AEI, other think tanks that are normally associated with the Republican Party, and they've been very open about the need to have more competition. That's a free market value as well as a progressive value.
So, Adam, stick with us, please. We have a lot more to talk to you about. But in the meantime, we are following this roll call vote going on at the convention. We're in the state of Wisconsin right now, which is the host state in some fashion, if you can be, of a virtual convention, and they're in Milwaukee. And right after Wisconsin, we expect Delaware to come in. That will be the moment that Joe Biden's home state votes, and that's now.
That's always been his North Star. Delivering for families like his own, working people who struggle and sacrifice to build a better life. Nobody has ever had to wonder who Joe Biden's in it for.
Our nation faces daunting challenges, but I've known Joe Biden for 40 years, and there's nobody I trust more to lead our party, unite our country, and restore our standing in the world. What's more, he's humble. He tells the truth. He treats everybody he encounters with respect and builds bridges, not walls. He is a leader made for this moment and the finest public servant I've ever known.
Delaware is proud to cast its 32 votes for our favorite son and our next president.
Our friend, Delaware, Joe Biden.
Have it without the balloons falling, without the confetti, with all the knocks. Although you can see some reaction on Zoom. It appears that Joe Biden is pleased, if not surprised, as he smiles. And we see a lot of people applauding this. And normally we'd have a big celebration, but we don't have a real convention. Let's turn now to our chief Washington correspondent. And he is host of Bloomberg Radio's Sound On. That is on Bloomberg Radio every single day. Kevin Cirilli. So, Kevin, some reaction.
Look, I think there's 3 points that I would make here. First and foremost, that this is largely trying on the Democrats' behalf to have a widespread unifying appeal, whether it's in certain cases Republicans speaking or whether it's in freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who gave about a 90-second remarks earlier this evening in which she said that it was the beginning of a new type of Democratic coalition. But the second point that I would make here is that for the Democrats, it really raises the question of whether or not this broad coalition is going to play well in key battleground states, in key swing districts like Michigan, like Wisconsin, like parts of Pennsylvania. The third point that I would make here is that for other rising stars, like freshman Congressman Connor Lamb, another centrist Democrat from Pennsylvania, he wasn't given as much speaking time as someone like an AOC. So that contrast, when I talk to my Republican sources, David, is something that they are clearly aware of. They're looking at things like the Green New Deal, and they're trying to portray this as a message of a party that has gone too far left and a nominee who has lost control of it.
Okay, thank you so much to Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent, as we have been seeing Joe Biden and Dr. Joe Biden, his wife, actually in a classroom, as I understand. We're going to hear from her later on. She is a teacher. She has a doctorate in education. We'll hear from her just a little later on. Meantime, Adam Posen, I want to come back to you, the president of the Peterson Institute. One of the really interesting questions I see emerging right now is this a different approach to economy? Because certainly Bernie Sanders thinks it is, Ocasio-Cortez thinks it is. At the same time, some people would like to portray Joe Biden as pretty much a moderate. Do we know what we're getting in a Joe Biden when it comes to managing the economy?
I think we do. I think it is going to be further left in a frankly constructive way than some of the Obama policies were, but I think it's still going to stop far short of Bernie Sanders or AOC's dreams. And, I think it's important to keep a perspective on this. There are a lot of economies in the world, including of very free market allies of the U.S., like the United Kingdom, like Australia, like Canada, as well as places like South Korea, Japan, and especially Germany and Northern Europe, that are far more mixed economies in an open way, and mixed of government and private sector, and it hasn't hurt that much. I mean, there was an argument to be made in the 70s and 80s when their welfare states and their wages and taxes were so excessive and the U.S. was being more dynamic. But that gap is hugely closed, and we've had repeated crises. And so it's only reasonable for people to say, okay, the U.S. doesn't need to be a crazy outlier. And of course, this will start with healthcare. That's going to be the biggest shift in some ways for average people, I think, under President Biden, if he's elected.
Yeah, and so, Adam, in terms of his approach overseas, we're hearing an awful lot that he is going to be forming alliances, that he wants to restore the allies that we once had, that Democrats feel have been lost under President Trump. So if he's elected and he moves in that direction, and we think about it in terms of President Trump's approach to China, how do you think Joe Biden handles that? Because one of the criticisms we hear over and over about his time as vice president was that under President Obama, Vice President Biden didn't do enough to take on China. And he's talked strong since then and during the campaign. But what do you think he does in terms of taking on China beyond trying to work with our allies?
I think you're absolutely right that the biggest difference between a Biden presidency and a Trump presidency vis-a-vis China is the methods and how much you pick fights with your potential allies versus bring them on side. I think that the Trump administration, the Biden administration, Biden campaign, unfortunately are just going to be in a tit-for-tat match between now and the election, trying to talk who's going to be tougher and who was softer. And frankly, China's a large place with nuclear weapons and its own economy and a lot of support domestically for its government. So the ability of the U.S. to talk tough is not that constructive. If one thing that could change is that you will see greater regard for human rights, including, let's say, the oppression of the Uyghur population, the Muslims in Northwest China, or what's happening in Hong Kong. That's not an economic matter, and the American public and the American Congress and president can decide to pursue that. And that'll have economic costs, but we can decide it's worth it. That'll be a difference. But beyond the working with allies, I think the biggest thing that will happen is the question of how much you make this a battle with the Chinese Communist Party and focused on national security threats versus how much you yield the ground in terms of soft power, in terms of, as Joe and I used to say, in terms of human exchange, in terms of exchange of ideas, in terms of letting technology flow. And I think there are a lot of Democrats who are at least as hawkish, as it would be said, think of Senator Mark Warner from Virginia, as some of the Republicans and even some of the Trump people. And I frankly think that's counterproductive. But that's where I think a lot of the debate is going to be about how you implement the technology relations, how many barriers you put up outside of narrowly defined national security or human rights conflict.
Adam, maybe swinging back to domestic policy, you talked earlier about the importance of the stimulus, and we've heard for 3 years Donald Trump's interest in doing a infrastructure bill. Many people think that is a good way to put people to work and create an economic stimulus that has lasting impact. Joe Biden, through his Build Back Better campaign, is talking about doing the same thing. Do you think we have a chance, as a part of whoever is elected president next term, to get a substantial investment in our infrastructure as part of a stimulus package for post-COVID economic recovery?
I certainly would hope so. I mean, as you're implying, it's something that when interest rates are this low, when our public infrastructure is broken down, when we have unemployed skilled people or even unskilled people who need new work, this is a great thing to invest in. When the returns in the private markets, as seen in the interest rates, are just not that attractive, of course you want to do public investment. And so it is one of the shames of the last several years, or the last few years, that we did not get an infrastructure bill when it would have made perfectly good sense. I think another difference, Biden versus Trump, is we might get an infrastructure bill under President Trump's second term, depending on the composition of Congress. But it should be a bridge, not to Green New Deal fantasy, but towards gradual decarbonization of the U.S. economy, towards new energy. And I think that piece of the infrastructure deal would be very different under the two administrations. But this is one of those things where, as you imply rightly, it's essentially $50 bills sitting on the ground. We should pick it up. And it's a shame that we haven't been able to agree to do that yet.
Okay, Adam, it is always such a pleasure, a real treat to have you with us. That's Adam Posen. He's the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Coming up, we're going to have much more from the convention. The theme of that, by the way, tonight is Leadership Matters. I talked with former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson on that subject. What is leadership at the top of the government, particularly when it comes to national security and issues of Homeland Security? That's coming up on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
I'm David Westin. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
In this job interview, the difference is stark. You know what Donald Trump will do with 4 more years. Blame, bully, and belittle. And you know what Joe Biden will do. Build back better.
That was former President Bill Clinton. He's speaking earlier tonight at the Democratic National Convention about leadership, particularly leadership in the Oval Office. Leadership is the theme tonight at the Democratic National Convention, particularly on national security and foreign policy. I spoke to former Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson earlier today about the qualities that America's next commander-in-chief will need to meet the coming challenges over the next 4 years.
Experience teaches, history teaches, that one could never fully know what's awaiting you in your inbox when you take office on January 20. I mean, George Bush 43, for example, could not have known on January 20, 2001, that he was going to be grappling with 9/11 and the aftermath 9 months later. But obviously, in terms of security issues, COVID, I fully expect that we'll still be wrestling with COVID, the pandemic, by January. Longer-term challenges, global warming, the threats represented by China, by Russia, by Iran, specifically the cybersecurity threats. ODNI recently put out statements about how the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians are messing around with our democracy. So there will be any number of challenges facing whoever the president is in the next presidential term.
It was like the COVID-19, to take that first one first, because it's so much on everyone's mind right now. What leadership do we need, whether we've had it or not, when you have that kind of crisis? I mean, it's a pandemic we haven't seen for over 100 years now. But what is leadership in that sort of crisis?
Good question. I think the answer is staring us in the face. I think we've seen some very good examples of leadership through this crisis. And what the American people, in my experience and in my observation, most appreciate about good leadership is simply telling us the truth. What is the truth about the danger we face and how we solve it and what we, the American public, can do to solve it? Too often politicians believe that they need to tell the public what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. And in my experience, if you simply are straight with the American people, if you tell the truth about the problem and how to solve it, they will respond. If you treat the public like grown-ups and not as fools, we will respond. And so in a number of jurisdictions in a number of states around the country, including here in the Northeast, we've had strong leadership that has encouraged discipline when it comes to physical distancing, wearing masks, and the trend lines in New York State have all been good from the depths of where we were in say, mid-April, because people have been oriented toward not becoming casual, not letting their guard down, and taking this very seriously, thanks to the leadership, I believe, of Governor Cuomo and his straight talk to New Yorkers.
You have been at the upper levels of leadership in the federal government. I must say it's a fairly rare thing for the President of the United States to look us all in the eye and give us bad news and own up to it. What are the forces that prevent that? I mean, you gave the example of Governor Cuomo. He did not apparently hesitate to say, this is bad and you're not going to like it. We don't often hear that from a president, Democrat or Republican. What are the pressures on leaders at the national level that prevent them from being straight with us?
There are a couple of things in a couple of different contexts. One, obviously politics can play a role in different contexts that, for whatever reason, will act as a deterrent to being straight with the American people. And that is unfortunate. I always tried to tell the truth to the American people when we were in a time of high anxiety. And my approach was, first of all, tell the truth about the threat we face. Then, number two, explain to the American public what their government is doing about it. Here are the 10 things your government, your Department of Homeland Security, is doing to address the current threat. And then number three, what you, the American people, can do to support our efforts and protect yourselves. And when you do those three things, I believe people understand that we do not live in a risk-free society, whether it's COVID, whether it's a cyber attack, whether it's the possibility of another terrorist attack, as long as you're straight with the American people and you let them know that the government is on the job, working as hard as we possibly can to protect the American people. And if you do that, they're willing to partner with us in government to help.
How does one strike the right balance between, if I put it this way, transmitting and receiving as a leader, particularly when it comes to things where lives are on the line? That could be COVID-19, it could be national security issues, it could be homeland security issues. How do you strike the right balance between listening, taking conflicting views in, but at some point saying, no, but I'm going to decide? You can err on either side.
Good question. When I was in office, I made a point of having within my inner circle, within the Department of Homeland Security, people who I knew were going to give me the in-house company line, and people whose views very often mirrored that of the larger public. For example, on any immigration issue, I'd have the pro-enforcement types from ICE, from CBP, but I also wanted to have around the table people who represented the views of immigration reformists, the activists, those outside the Department of Homeland Security. And when you get a range of divergent views, that is the environment for healthy government decision-making.
That was part of my conversation with former Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson. As Jeh Johnson said just now, one of the issues the president, whether that be Donald Trump or Joe Biden, will have to address after the election will be our relations with China. And for this perspective from Beijing, welcome back now, Bloomberg Markets co-anchor Tom McKenzie. Great to have you back with us, Tom. You heard, I'm sure, that President Trump on his visit to Arizona today said, you know, I'm in no big rush to talk to the Chinese. We're not talking trade right now because I don't want to, because I don't like what they did in the COVID-19 situation. How's that being received over there?
Well, we're still waiting for an official reaction to that. But there's a couple of key takeaways. One is that the relationship, the personal relationship between President Trump and President Xi, which Trump, of course, was touting up until the early part of this year, that appears to have changed, at least for President Trump. And that was something that the Chinese were holding on to as a sliver of hope in terms of relations between the two countries. So that is important. On the trade talks front, look, consistently, China has wanted to hold to this phase one deal. Obviously, in terms of their commitments around purchases, they are way behind because of the COVID impact. But in recent weeks, they have been stepping up their purchases. And there's very little sign that China wants to walk away from the phase one trade deal. They will make efforts to try and keep that on board. But of course, there's a raft of other issues that China is having to wrestle with. Just in the last 12 to 24 hours or so, we had the State Department in the US coming out and pressuring, or at least advising US companies, US universities, I should say, to divest their investments in Chinese companies. So that's the theme around delisting those Chinese companies. That is something that's been digested here in Beijing as well. And of course, the attempts to further curb Huawei, a major company here, one of the biggest companies in China, employs tens of thousands of people. You get a sense of the importance when you look at the front page of the China Daily. But in terms of the DNC, that is also in focus for officials here in China. They were wrong-footed in 2016. They put all their research into Hillary Clinton. They thought she was going to win, and they were wrong-footed when Trump gained power and won that election. In terms of what is happening here in China and the way it's being displayed, the Global Times, it's a state-run tabloid here. You've got it on the front page. You can see Joe Biden. The headline says that the Trump administration is playing the China card to try and win votes. And then down the side, it talks about some of the big political beasts in the Democratic Party taking aim at Trump and criticizing him. So it's being followed. And in terms of the trade talks, again, China will be very keen to try and keep that phase one deal on track, even as they look to all these other issues around WeChat and TikTok and Huawei, the South China Sea and Taiwan. They've been relatively restrained in their response to that. The question is, as you lead up to November, if there's more action from the US, can China continue to remain restrained?
Tom, I'm fascinated by the research on Hillary Clinton that went into the wastebasket, as it were, because President Trump got elected. In the early days of President Trump, some 3.5 years ago, there were lots of reports that the Chinese were spending a lot of time and effort trying to figure out this man, understand what makes him tick. Are they getting slightly inured to this now? I mean, have we gone to that well too many times? Because it's not clear that they can really manage President Trump.
That's absolutely true. They thought at the beginning that he was someone they could do deals with. And certainly when you talk to members of the elite here and business executives, they said, this is a man we can discuss issues on and strike a deal with. They've been wrong-footed time and time again. They will continue to do their research around Biden and around a second term for Trump. You can be sure of that.
Tom, thank you so much. That was a great report from Tom McKenzie, our colleague and co-anchor over in Beijing. We are now waiting at the convention for Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State, to appear. We have yet another Republican, erstwhile Republican, who's going to be talking about Joe Biden and leadership, because the theme of tonight, as we've said, is about leadership, particularly from the Oval Office. And so in the meantime, so instead we're going to go to something else. We're going to go to unlikely friendship in Washington, Joe Biden's relationship with I'm sorry, we're going to go to Jeannie. I'm getting conflicting messages here, Jeannie. So as we look at the Chinese relationship, how fraught is this for Joe Biden if he actually becomes president?
You know, very. It's one of many issues in the foreign policy arena and the economic arena that's on his agenda day one if he becomes president. You've got China, you've got North Korea, you've got Iran, you've also got the issue of climate, and that is something very big on his agenda. So around the world, the issue of allies and how he deals with relationships that they feel have been fraught. So he's got so many issues on his plate, but China's certainly one of the biggest, because it's not just a foreign policy issue, it's not just a humanitarian issue, it's also a really important economic issue for the United States. And I go back to the fact that I think one of the criticisms of President Obama and Vice President Biden is they weren't able to deal with that, and many people are curious as to what changes under a Biden presidency from an Obama presidency.
Well, there may not be a lot of spontaneity or uncertainty in the production of this convention, but there certainly is in trying to follow a virtual convention, because we're told that Colin Powell is about to speak, but it appears that they're a little bit behind in their timing now, and that's what we're doing, is we're waiting for Colin Powell, because we want to bring you that, let you listen to that, and then after that, I'm told we will have something of a tape that is narrated in part by Cindy McCain about the relationship between her late husband, the late Senator John McCain, who ran for president himself, and Joe Biden, who had formed quite a close relationship over the years. And now we're going to go to Colin Powell, who is speaking at the convention.
And set out for America. 3 years later, a ship pulled into New York Harbor, and a young Jamaican woman gazed up at the Statue of Liberty for the first time. They became my parents, and they inspired me to finish college and join the Army. This began a journey of service that would take me from basic training to combat in Vietnam, up the ranks to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State. The values I learned growing up in the South Bronx and serving in uniform were the same values that Joe Biden's parents instilled in him in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I support Joe Biden for the presidency of the United States because those values still define him, and we need to restore those values to the White House. Our country needs a commander-in-chief who takes care of our troops in the same way he would his own family. For Joe Biden, that doesn't need teaching. It comes from the experience he shares with millions of military families, sending his beloved son off to war and praying to God he would come home safe. Joe Biden will be a president we will all be proud to salute. With Joe Biden in the White House, you will never doubt that he will stand with our friends and stand up to our adversaries, never the other way around. He will trust our diplomats and our intelligence community, not the flattery of dictators and despots. He will make it his job to know when anyone dares to threaten us. He will stand up to our adversaries with strength and experience. They will know he means business. I support Joe Biden because beginning on day one, he will restore Americans' leadership and our moral authority. He'll be a president who knows that America is strongest when, as he has said, we lead both by the power of our example and the example of our power. He will restore America's leadership in the world and restore the alliances we need to address the dangers that threaten our nation, from climate change to nuclear proliferation. Today, we are a country divided, and we have a president doing everything in his power to make it that way and keep us that way. What a difference it will make to have a president who unites us, who restores our strength and our soul. I still believe that in our hearts, we are the same America that brought my parents to our shores, an America that inspires freedom around the world. That's the America Joe Biden will lead as our next president. Thank you very much.
That is Colin Powell, former Secretary of State and also former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, speaking on behalf of Joe Biden. And now there's a video going on. We're introducing John McCain. We expect a video actually narrated by Cindy McCain. Let's listen to that.
But in the 1970s, Joe was assigned a military aide for a trip overseas.
I was the Navy's Senate liaison and used to carry your bags on overseas trips.
The son of a gun never carried my bags. He was supposed to carry my bags, David, but he never carried my bags.
And that is a bit of the video playing at the convention. That is Cindy McCain talking about her late husband, the Senator John McCain, and his relationship with Joe Biden. And we go now to Rick Davis, our political contributor, because Rick, of course, you were very close to John McCain, ran a presidential campaign for him. And I know you're close with Cindy McCain as well. Talk to us about this relationship.
Well, you know, it's two men from different backgrounds, after a while from different parties with different ambitions and a view of the world, but they found a unique relationship that was both a friendship and a desire to work together to make the world a better place. And that really is what characterizes the relationship between John and Joe Biden. Joe Biden served as a mentor of John McCain early on. This film shows that John McCain was still in the Navy when he first met Senator Biden on a trip overseas. And then when John ultimately became a senator from Arizona, a colleague of Joe Biden's, they worked together and they fought together. But at the end of the night, they could go off and have a cocktail and discuss the world as they see it. And as Americans, they always saw the world the same way. So it's a stroll down memory lane, but I think an important value lesson for people who watch it, and that is that you can fight like dogs and cats all day long over politics, but at the end of the day, you know, you're all Americans, and you got to work together to make the world a safer place and a better place.
You can fight like dogs and cats, but come together, or you could. Is that still possible today? Because it strikes me, looking at the late Senator John McCain and also at Colin Powell, who just gave the remarks, is there a place in the Republican Party for Republicans of that ilk today, or has President Trump so fundamentally transformed the party that it's pushing them out?
Well, the one thing that is a lesson to me over my time, 40 years in politics, is as soon as you think you've figured it out, it's going to change. The environment today is different than it was when John McCain first became a United States Senator, and it's going to be different 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 12 years from now. So what you strive to do is make it better. And I think that there are people in the United States Senate from both parties, in the House of Representatives from both parties, who are interested in working together to get something done. And if we can get some daylight in Washington away from partisanship and politics, you've got a chance for the country to improve rapidly.
So Gina, let me ask you about the role of the center. Certainly on the Republican side, but one could say even on the Democrat side, as we see Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez really fighting for the left here. Where does the center go, or do they stay home?
I think that's the big question. I think we see the Democrats this week fighting hard to bring them over. That's why they have Colin Powell. That's why they have John Kasich. That's why they have Cindy McCain out there. And, you know, watching this video, there's so much nostalgia there. But to your point, you wonder, is that kind of relationship possible today? And certainly the person who wins the White House this year is going to attract those independents and moderates. That is really what this is about. You've got to win in those swing states. You've got to pull those people over. And if they stay home, both sides are going to be in trouble. And of course, when it comes to governing, then we are all in trouble, because you get these intractable positions like we have with the second stimulus, where nobody wants to bend, even in a time of a crisis, which is, you know, just stunning when you think about it.
So Rick, as you say, politics changes, everything changes, but certainly politics changed over time. There was a time that at least I thought that people fought for the people in the middle, the undecideds, as they were called. Is that true anymore? Because my sense is increasingly it's more just going to your base and getting them to turn out and be really, really passionate. You don't need necessarily as many of them as long as they really come out and vote for you.
Yeah, I think it's actually changed quite a bit. I mean, in 2004, Karl Rove said about the Bush reelection that all we need is some more white evangelicals from Ohio who are already for us to turn out. We don't need new people. We just need our current base to show up even more. In the polling today, it's a different scene. There's so much that's changed about the fabric of the parties. The Democrats have moved further left. The Republicans have become more of a Trump kit party. And there are a lot of people washing around in the center, and it's not an ideological center. In many cases, it's the center of the country, in these suburbs, who don't have a party that represents their hopes and dreams and aspirations. And so where do they go? In the polling today, that shows as much as 14% of those voters who have maybe historically supported the Republican Party are looking for a home. And if the Democrats can reach out, and I think all these things we've been talking about, whether it's the Governor Kasich speech or the John McCain video or the Colin Powell discussion tonight, these are all ways to have a conversation with those voters where the Democratic Party isn't used to having that conversation, to pull them into the Democratic Party.
So, Jeannie, I'm always reluctant to say it's different this time because it often isn't different. But I wonder, given coronavirus, given the uncertainty, given the economic situation we have right now, you and I have talked about that census survey that's been done, how many people across the country of every political stripe are really worried about a roof over their heads, having food on their table, having a job. I wonder if there's an opportunity for a candidate, it can be Donald Trump, it can be Joe Biden, to really cut across the ideology and just say, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to make sure you have a better life.
I think there absolutely is an opportunity, and that data that the census collected showing the amount of insecurity there is out there is just astounding, and I've never seen anything like it. And yet I don't think we've seen either candidate yet, and there's still time, effectively do that. And so, if somebody was able to do that, that's where you could pull over this 14% that Rick was just talking about, or at least some of them, and that can make an enormous difference. But, that takes a willingness to work across the aisle regardless of party, and I think that's where we see problems. I have to say, Joe Biden seems to suggest a willingness to do that. Right. The president hasn't, throughout his 4 years in office yet, or 3 years in office yet, shown that much of a willingness to try to reach out, and I think that's where some of the concern lies.
We want to bring in now Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent. Thanks for staying with us here, Kevin. Give us your sense of this. Are the Republicans, and particularly Donald Trump, worried at all about picking off some Republicans as they put on Colin Powell, and they put on John Kasich, and they put on Cindy McCain?
Well, I will keep this very, very tight. Look, I think if you have two former secretaries of state, former Secretary of State John Kerry, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, and then the widow of one of the most maverick, the self-described maverick, in Cindy McCain, that would have been in a convention hall, and Rick knows this, and Jeannie knows this, you know this, David, that would have been lightning in a bottle. But whether or not it alienates the base, we don't know. But I still am not sure, and Republicans and Democrats I talk to are not sure, whether this will break through in this virtual medium. Now tonight we await from Dr. Jill Biden, who is going to add, I'm told, a personal touch to her husband in an address that likely will drive many a headline.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you so much to Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent. So Jeannie, what about that personal touch, but also the education? Because she is an educator, and she's going to be coming, as I understand, from a classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's also one of the very few married to the vice president who continued to work and to teach when he was in office. And, that is something that Joe Biden has talked a lot about, and that does distinguish her. And she has had a career in education, and it is an area in which a lot of work needs to be done from a policies perspective. And it's something she obviously cares deeply about. We'll probably hear her talk about it a little bit tonight, but certainly if elected, may end up being part of the platform that she uses as First Lady.
And Rick Davis, as we continue to wait for Jill Biden, the former Second Lady of the United States, to come, Dr. Jill Biden, and talk to us, it does strike me that we're going to lose another iconic moment, I suspect, because typically when the vice president goes out and hugs, when the nominee goes out and hugs his wife, that's a big moment. That's running campaign ads all around. And we're not going to have that tonight.
No, I think Kevin Cirilli really touched it off. I mean, these are the kinds of moments that we were talking about earlier in the broadcast that are orchestrated, worked very hard around. And when they're done in a hall with thousands of people and there's this emotion and intensity and excitement, you can feel it on the other end of the TV tube. But tonight, we get to watch it on video clips and make our own judgments as to how influential that is. It's unfortunate. I think that some of the headlines about the digital convention will kill the regular convention, I think, are the opposite. I think after this 2 weeks of watching these digital conventions, everybody's going to want to have another convention where we can all pack ourselves into that hall and have a great time.
That's funny. I hope that happens. I mean, we'll see. Right now, I don't see it happening anytime soon, Jeannie. It doesn't seem to, until we get a vaccine that's 100% effective. We continue to wait right now for Dr. Jill Biden to give her remarks, which is the highlight of this second night of the virtual convention in the Democratic Party. So what about education? Where does it figure in the policies? Because we don't hear a lot of discussion about it, at least I don't.
We don't. I mean, we hear an awful lot about the cost of a college education, the debt that students are carrying, which is, you know, enormous in this country. Of course, there are all sorts of challenges now given the pandemic and what is going on in school districts across the country as teachers and students and parents get ready to potentially either send their kids online or send them in person and are, you know, very, very worried about the health of their loved ones. So all of those things combined. But you're right, we haven't heard as much as we have in some, you know, in years past, things like No Child Left Behind and a concerted effort to change the shape of education in this country, which is, of course, controlled at the local and state level, but of which the federal government plays an enormous role in issues like funding and direction and those kinds of things. And, of course, we should mention the teachers union, an awfully important part of the Democratic coalition historically.
And now I believe we are going to hear from Dr. Jill Biden, who's beginning her speech from a school. Let's go to that now.
I have always loved the sounds of a classroom, the quiet that sparks with possibility just before students shuffle in, the murmur of ideas bouncing back and forth as we explore the world together, the laughter and tiny moments of surprise you find in materials you've taught 1,000,000 times. When I taught English here at Brandywine High School, I would spend my summer preparing for the school year about to start, filled with anticipation. But this quiet is heavy. You can hear the anxiety that echoes down empty hallways. There's no scent of new notebooks or freshly waxed floors. The rooms are dark as the bright young faces that should fill them are now confined to boxes on a computer screen. I hear it from so many of you. The frustration of parents juggling work while they support their children's learning, or are afraid that their kids might get sick from school. The concern of every person working without enough protection. The despair in the lines that stretch out before food banks. And the indescribable sorrow that follows every lonely last breath when the ventilators turn off. As a mother and a grandmother, as an American, I am heartbroken by the magnitude of this loss, by the failure to protect our communities, by every precious and irreplaceable life gone. Like so many of you, I'm left asking, how do I keep my family safe? You know, motherhood came to me in a way I never expected. I fell in love with a man and 2 little boys standing in the wreckage of unthinkable loss, mourning a wife and mother, a daughter and sister. I never imagined at the age of 26 I would be asking myself, how do you make a broken family whole? Still, Joe always told the boys, Mommy sent Jill to us, and how could I argue with her? And so we figured it out together in those big moments that would go by too fast, Thanksgivings and state championships, birthdays and weddings, in the mundane ones that we didn't even know were shaping our lives, reading stories piled on the couch, rowdy Sunday dinners and silly arguments, listening to the faint sounds of laughter that would float downstairs as Joe put the kids to bed every night, while I studied for grad school or graded papers under the pale yellow kitchen lamp, the dinner dishes waiting in the sink. We found that love holds a family together. Love makes us flexible and resilient. It allows us to become more than ourselves together. And though it can't protect us from the sorrows of life, it gives us refuge, a home. How do you make a broken family whole? The same way you make a nation whole. With love and understanding, and with small acts of kindness, with bravery, with unwavering faith. You show up for each other in big ways and small ones, again and again. It's what so many of you are doing right now for your loved ones, for complete strangers, for your communities. There are those who want to tell us that our country is hopelessly divided, that our differences are irreconcilable. But that's not what I've seen over these last few months. We're coming together and holding on to each other. We're finding mercy and grace in the moments we might have once taken for granted. We're seeing that our differences are precious and our similarities infinite. We have shown that the heart of this nation still beats with kindness and courage. That's the soul of America Joe Biden is fighting for now. After our son Beau died of cancer, I wondered if I would ever smile or feel joy again. It was summer, but there was no warmth left for me. 4 days after Beau's funeral, I watched Joe shave and put on his suit. I saw him steel himself in the mirror, take a breath, put his shoulders back, and walk out into a world empty of our son. He went back to work. That's just who he is. There are times when I couldn't even imagine how he did it, how he put one foot in front of the other and kept going. But I've always understood why he did it. For the daughter who convinces her mom to finally get a breast cancer screening and misses work to drive her to the clinic. For the community college student who has faced homelessness and survived abuse, but finds the grit to finish her degree and make a good life for her kids. For the little boy whose mom is serving as a Marine in Iraq, who puts on a brave face in his video call and doesn't complain when the only thing he wants for his birthday is to be with her. For all those people Joe gives his personal phone number to at rope lines and events, the ones he talks to for hours after dinner, helping them smile through their loss, letting them know that they aren't alone. He does it for you. Joe's purpose has always driven him forward. His strength of will is unstoppable, and his faith is unshakable. Because it's not in politicians or political parties or even in himself. It's in the providence of God. His faith is in you, in us. Yes, so many classrooms are quiet right now. The playgrounds are still. But if you listen closely, you can hear the sparks of change in the air. Across this country, educators, parents, first responders, Americans of all walks of life are putting their shoulders back, fighting for each other. We haven't given up. We just need leadership worthy of our nation, worthy of you, honest leadership to bring us back together, to recover from this pandemic and prepare for whatever else is next. Leadership to reimagine what our nation will be. That's Joe. He and Kamala will work as hard as you do every day to make this nation better. And if I have the honor of serving as your First Lady, I will too. And with Joe as president, these classrooms will ring out with laughter and possibility once again. The burdens we carry are heavy, and we need someone with strong shoulders. I know that if we entrust this nation to Joe, he will do for your family what he did for ours. Bring us together and make us whole. Carry us forward in our time of need. Keep the promise of America for all of us.
Great job. God, love it. How are you? Hey, everyone. I'm Jill Biden's husband. As you heard tonight, excuse me, you can see why she's the love of my life, the rock of our family. She never gives herself much credit, but the truth is she's the strongest person I know. She's a backbone like a ramrod. She loves fiercely, cares deeply. Nothing stops her when she sets her mind to getting something right. And, you know, for all of you out there across the country, just think of your favorite educator who gave you the confidence to believe in yourself. That's the kind of First Lady this Jill Biden will be. God love you.
So go to JoeBiden.com to join our campaign.
Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon. Thank you.
And there you have it, Dr. Jill Biden, former Second Lady of the United States of America, wife of Joe Biden. And we had a little appearance there by the former vice president, about to be the presidential nominee, with his wife, hugging her and expressing his great appreciation and confidence and affection for her. So Rick, you said this is a terribly important moment here when we're introduced to Jill Biden in a way that a lot of Americans have not been as yet. It seems to me she appeared both as a mother and as a teacher. It's hard to beat those two.
No, this was a really well-orchestrated communication to the American public by Dr. Jill Biden. Introduced herself through her narrative of her family and the trajectory they've had through difficult times, and created the parallels about how the country has difficult times, just like their family. And they relied on Joe Biden to get them through that personally, and that the country can rely on that too. Clearly a very good pitch to suburban women who are interested in issues relevant to education and are worried about the education of their own children and where that goes in a COVID and post-COVID environment. So I think it was an interesting approach to have the night really anchored around her. And my guess is they'll see some benefit from it.
Yeah, Jeannie, it did strike me. She talked about the quiet being heavy in the classroom. And it was for the children. And she said, now we have to see them on a face in a box and a screen rather than in the classroom. But she also talked about childcare and the burden placed on a lot of mothers and fathers whose children are home and one has to take care of them.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by her being in a classroom that quiet and alone and talking to the American public because, of course, so many of us as parents, and I'm also a professor, I'm staring at students right now in this box. I have kids. They are, still not certain when and if they're going back and how. So to see her talking about what so many of us are going through, and of course, you mentioned so many people who are struggling to work and stay at home, I thought it was really effective in that regard because, of course, this is what so many of us are dealing with. And, I do think it's a very tough speech to give. I was just thinking, too, imagine if she had the crowd there and she was at a convention where people were together. But I thought she delivered it very well. And I do think she humanized Joe Biden. And we've heard so many of us about the story about his son, about his first wife and his infant daughter. But to hear it from her perspective, I think, you can't help but be moved by that.
And Rick, it strikes me that what we just heard from Dr. Joe Biden, but frankly, we've heard from others as well, the notion that Joe Biden, the former vice president, is a caring, compassionate man. That is, I think, in many people's minds, a true alternative to President Trump. A lot of people would say he's a strong man, he has strong views, he stands up for things. I'm not sure a lot of people have seen that side of Donald J. Trump.
Well, I mean, we're not sure that side exists, and I'm not sure Donald Trump wants to have that side. I mean, he is who he is. If anybody was wondering whether or not they would have a choice in this year's election between two distinctly different people, they've got one now. And I do think, as it relates to the speech by Dr. Jill Biden, I think 1 week from now, we'll be saying, gee, how did Dr. Jill Biden's speech compare to the First Lady's and what she did on the stage of the Republican convention about a week from now? And so that'll be an interesting contrast to also paint.
Yeah, that will be tough, Jeannie. I think it's fair to say, to go up against Dr. Jill Biden.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know when Melania Trump delivered her address last time, there were portions of it which seemed to be, used from the former First Lady, Michelle Obama. So that is something that she's going to have to contend with next week.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's been a fascinating evening, actually, in so many regards, having former Republicans speak out on behalf of Joe Biden, hearing from the former presidents, Bill Clinton, as well as Jimmy Carter. And by the way, John Fitzgerald Kennedy's daughter, Caroline, we heard from earlier as well. So that will be doing it for tonight. Our thanks now to Bloomberg political contributors Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College. Coming up tomorrow, our special coverage will continue. We'll bring you the speech of Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris. Also on tap, former President Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Speaker Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, and Elizabeth Warren. Our coverage begins tomorrow at 10 p.m. in New York, 10 a.m. in Hong Kong. This has been coverage of the Democratic National Convention on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin, and this is Bloomberg.
True diversification. That's what adding commodities exposure to your stock and bond portfolio can help provide. The Bloomberg Commodity Index is the standard for commodity market exposure. 23 traded commodities are represented: agriculture, livestock, metals, and energy. The Bloomberg Commodity Index is the benchmark most widely used by investment professionals globally. Track your commodity investments with a proven financial information partner. The Bloomberg Commodity Index. True diversification.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
It's almost 11 a.m. in Singapore and Hong Kong. I'm Haslinda Amin. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia.
And I'm Yvonne Mann. Here are the top stories. Hong Kong markets to resume trading this afternoon after Typhoon Egos forced a cancellation of morning business. Hong Kong Exchange reports first half earnings at midday. President Trump says he canceled last weekend's Phase 1 review. He blames China's handling of the coronavirus and warns he does not want to talk to Beijing right now. And we speak to the head of the Australian cloud-based logistics company WiseTech as shares soar on the back of earnings. CEO Richard White joins us exclusively later on this hour.
And Vaughn, like you said, the Hong Kong trading will restart in the afternoon after that amber rainstorm warning was cancelled. Of course, Hong Kong cancelled its morning trading because of Typhoon Hegos. That will resume in the afternoon. Taking a look at the other markets, Asian markets in the money for a third day after U.S. stocks closed above the February highs for the first time. U.S. futures pointing to a pretty muted open, up about 0.1%. The S&P 500 capping a 52% rally from its March low. Massive stimulus injections contributing to the gains. The S&P headed towards its fifth straight month of gains. We have the CSI 300 lower by 0.6%. The China X lower by about 2, set for its lowest in a week. Of course, that's after the Trump administration warned U.S. colleges to divest Chinese shares. And the Kospi up by 0.6%, rebounding from yesterday's sharp slide. Samsung, one to watch, and may benefit from U.S. renewed restrictions on Huawei. Samsung trading in the money right now. Flip the page. Take a look at where we are in terms of the JCI and the PCOM. Both Indonesia and the Philippines decide on rates today. Both central banks expected to keep rates on hold. With a weak rupiah, Governor BI may be forced to avoid another rate cut, even though the pandemic continues to slam the economy. BI, of course, has cut rates 100 basis points so far this year. Gold futures down 0.4%, but still gold prices above that 2,000 mark. It has climbed up above 2,000 on haven demand, but right now down 0.4%. And New York crude lower by about 0.5%. Oil easing on expectations for rising gasoline stockpiles in the U.S., compounding supply concerns as OPEC Plus eases its output cuts this month. Now, let's get more on the market. Our next guest says he would not add equities to his portfolios and buying on the basis that the crisis is over and that we have a vaccine is not the right strategy. Let's bring in Andrew Ferris, CEO of financial and economic advisory firm Ecognosis. Andrew, thanks for joining us. Now, you know what? The rally so far has not been based on fundamentals. It's been based on stimulus, and it does seem like central banks and governments are keen to provide the stimulus, will do whatever it takes. So the rally has legs.
Well, I'm sorry. Actually, this is just not true. In the case of the United States, they have not agreed on the $2 trillion package, and they have not agreed at all on how that package is going to be distributed. So I'm not quite sure if I was to take the biggest economy that they are okay in providing more money. The European Union has. Okay, the UK, which is almost now not a part of the European Union, they're still thinking about this. And Japan just had just about the worst numbers you can possibly think of. And I'm sure they will be continue doing what they're doing. So it is a rather mixed view. And if I was actually think that I should buy the stock market because the government is going, particularly in the case of the United States, is going to support more direct wage payments to people to keep them out of destitute. Okay, this is not really something that is going to affect directly earnings. This is the other thing that it always makes me smile. Again, the idea that if they continue to give American workers $600 US per month to support them, this is very good. This is very good as far as food is concerned, and possibly as far as electricity, and possibly as far as some rental payments, but not anything else. It is essential. Okay, but on the basis of that I'm going to be buying forward earnings for 6 to 12 months, it isn't. So that's why I look at the behavior of the indexes and I say clearly they and I are looking at completely different considerations or even different completely numbers. I'm not for one moment saying that I know better. I'm simply saying that what I think I know doesn't encourage me to buy shares.
And even though you don't really have an optimistic view, you say don't buy gold because buying gold is like buying Bitcoin.
Absolutely. Look, buying gold, tell me, why should I buy gold? Because I think the price is going to go up. And why do I think the price is going to go up? Because other people are going to buy gold.